Before we get started, don't forget to like and follow for more impactful stories that will stick with you. A girl was accused of drug trafficking because she didn't look right in business class, and the staff pushed her too far until she called her father. What they didn't anticipate was Chuck Norris. "Ticket, darling, or are you taking it from someone who actually travels in business class?" The voice was slack and condescending, as if she had said the same thing to 100 people before. Tina. Without trying to conceal her sneer, she looked Maira up and down while her name tag was crookedly affixed to a faded airport vest. Maira handed out her ID and boarding pass as composedly as before. She had experienced worse, but this time Tina didn't simply question her. Instead, she appeared delighted. Then, Tina leaned in and narrowed her eyes at the ID, and she laughed. "Maira Norris, huh?" Maira nodded. "Then I assume you're attending a karate class." Drawing out the words like a joke, Tina said. Camp Martial Arts. Maira gave an equal response in Chicago. "Your father signed you up for that after Tina snorted, huh? Do you think he's Chuck Norris or someone?" Without blinking, Maira remarked, "That broke the dam." A few people in queue turned to stare at Tina as she burst out laughing, saying, "Oh, honey, please," in between giggles. "You really think that just slapping the name Norris on an ID makes you some kind of celebrity kid?" Tina's voice went a little low and said, "You know what, I think you swiped that ticket from somebody, or maybe you're running a scam. Kids do that or worse." Maira didn't respond. Her face remained motionless, but her hands clenched behind the counter. In addition, she tilted her head, saying, "You got something in that bag, huh? You acting all quiet, all polite, makes me nervous. Could be trying to hide something that is not." Maira became perplexed. Before she could finish, Tina leaned in and pretended to inspect the ID once more, while discreetly pressing a button beneath the desk with her other hand. "I have observed your type." Tina spoke loudly enough for other people to hear. "Intelligent, young females believing they can deceive their way out of actual security." When Maira's gaze shifted to the corner, two men in security gear began to approach her. She turned back to Tina, realizing her error. "I'm telling the truth, darling. I can show you the email with the ticket. Let the cops take care of it." Tina abruptly stepped back, as if she were afraid of her. "I don't deal with drugs." "What are you talking about? Runner's drug?" Maira's voice trembled a little more in amazement than fear. "I'm 17. Please move aside from the counter, ma'am," one of the security guards yelled, and they entered quickly, without speaking calmly or politely. One of them took her backpack, and the other reached for her arms. "Hold on, I'll explain." "I haven't done anything wrong. You'll have your chance to explain." Maira tried, but the first guard yanked her bag out of her hand and threw it on a table. The second guard grabbed her by the arm and pulled her back. The taller guard said, "We're checking for contraband right now." Opening the backpack roughly, people were watching, and now phones were coming out. Someone whispered, "What's going on?" But no one came forward. Inside her bag, they destroyed everything, including her notebook. Prack, she folded like a filthy towel. Jay's eye was yanked out and dropped. Tina said smugly from behind the counter that she had passed, but I had a strong hunch that a TSA marked her for further screening after one agent brought up a rolled-up wristband and sniffed it. When Maira's cheek started to burn, she remained silent and refused to cry. The agent then opened a side pocket and took out her protein bars and some spare change before turning back to her and pointing to a tiny bottle of her muscle recovery spray, that sports spray. Maira continued almost in a whisper, "I'm not smuggling anything. I'm not a criminal, and my dad will be here and he'll explain everything." He seemed uninterested, so she might need to make sure she was looking at him. The shorter one said, "Not even looking at her, and I'm Bruce Lee." Tina laughed again, even though the joke didn't work, and they didn't even give her a chance. Because she was wearing a hoodie, carrying a name that people didn't think belonged to her, and remaining silent when she could have yelled earlier, Maira stood there, breathless and heart palpitating, surrounded by people who saw her as a threat, rather than a teenager attempting to board a plane. With a slight smile, she moved over, leaned against the wall, and picked up her phone after it buzzed in her pocket. "Hello, Dad." The voice of Chuck Norris was gentle and familiar. "Are you certain you don't want me to accompany you, Pumpkin? I could take the next aircraft and arrive in 20 minutes. Maira chuckled to herself. "Dad, if you show up at LAX, you know what happens. I'll never make it through the gate. You've got a paparazzi magnet stuck to your back." He hesitated as if he didn't want to agree, but he knew she was right. "I don't like you flying alone, not with strangers. I'm fine." She said softly. "I need to do this alone just this once. Trust me." There was another pause, but this time it was longer. Chuck finally responded, "But you call me as soon as you land, Maira. I mean it." She vowed to love you even more. She hung off, put the phone back in her pocket and straightened up. But a few minutes later she regretted she had allowed him to come. A soft fabric bra and 2 pairs of underwear, one plain and the other an embarrassing shade of pink, came out of her bag as if the universe had decided to embarrass her with surgical precision. The contents spill out in waves, including neatly folded shirts, sweatpants rolled into bundles, a pouch with toiletries and a pair of practice gloves. She had thrown them in without thinking that morning, and they hit the floor with a quiet, weightless flop. Maira felt as though someone had suddenly pressed against her lungs, and she blinked once before falling to her knees without saying anything. Her hands were struggling to gather them before anyone else could see that her fingers weren't steady. Her heart was thudding inside her throat, and she could feel the burning heat creeping up the back of her neck. One pair had landed close to the edge of the security rope, and a man standing just outside the queue looked down before quickly averting his eye. Maira snatched them back and stuffed the fabric into the inner lining of her jacket. She didn't look at anyone because she didn't want to see the faces, and her fingers were still shaking when she tried to zip the side pocket closed. "The second," guard said. "I'll open it," and she quickly reached back to hand it over, but he grabbed both zippers and yanked them down in one violent motion. Her journal, a folded GTP, loose pens, wrapped protein bars, and, at the very end, a small ceramic mug. The a tiny crack, almost like glass under stress, was heard initially, and then it broke apart, splintering into 6 jagged pieces that skittered over the floor and bounced a little before landing around her shoes. Maira started for 1 beat, then 2, and then her knees gave way, not out of weakness but out of sheer instinct to reach, dropping palms open as though she could grasp what had already been lost. "No, no, no, please," she said, her voice smaller than she had anticipated, and it didn't echo like the shatter had behind her. "Geez, it's just a mug," one of the guards muttered. Tina's arms were folded tightly across her chest as she leaned against the wall, and her fingers curled inward as if she wasn't sure whether to pick them up or bury them. Then a voice came out louder, coated in sweet poison. "Well, that's strange. Didn't you say your dad's Chuck Norris?" Maira could hardly hear and didn't respond. Tina pushed off the wall, walking a few steps closer. "So which is it, sweetheart? Your real dad? Some martial arts movie star or some dead guy?" With a busted coffee mug, still no answer, she smirked. "Bit of a messy story, ain't it? Something cracked, not in the mug in Maira." She stood, her breath was shallow but her eyes were steel. Her hands curled into tight fists at her side, and for the first time since she landed in this terminal, she didn't feel afraid or humiliated. She felt rage, a rage that started in her belly and pushed upward through her ribs, through her throat, through her fists, before the first officer realized she'd moved her. Legs swung low in a clean, practiced arc. His knees buckled from under him, and he hit the ground with a heavy thud. The second lunged. She turned, used his weight against him, sent him stumbling into a stack of plastic bins near the conveyor people. Gasped, someone yelled, a woman screamed. The third man was larger. He caught her arm mid-motion, twisting it. Maira gritted her teeth and struck his side with her elbow, but his grip held. The fourth arrived from behind, hands wrapped around her waist. Pulling her backward, pinning her, she kicked once, twice. But they had her 4 grown men on one 17-year-old girl. Her arms were wrenched behind her back legs, flailing as she screamed, wordless, desperate. She was furious and no longer fighting to escape. Instead, she was fighting to be seen. Then, like a curtain parting, the noise subsided as a deep, calm voice cut through the air so deeply that the guards froze, their heavy hands still locked on her shoulders, elbows, waist, and click, click, click. The sound of hard-soled shoes. On tile was heard as a man in a dark grey blazer approached, his eyes grey. As bins were overturned, clothing was spilt and the bag was shredded as stones swept across the scene. The damaged cup and the girl breathing like a trapped animal on the floor behind him. A row of younger, more vigilant guards observed everything. "My name is Charles." Charles raised a hand in silence, then asked, "Can you stand?" Toira trembled, her arm still held by 2 officers, and she didn't respond. "I'm the terminal supervisor," he said, as the officers stammered. One said, "Alert," while another said, "She became violent after being provoked by someone else. Allow her to release her hands." Maira went forward onto her knees and then gently pushed herself upright. Her jacket was half off her shoulder and her palm was smeared with blood. She just gazed without saying anything or crying. After giving her a quick glance, Charles bent down to pick up the largest shard of the cup that was still on the floor. Family honor split clear through then. He rose up, met her eyes, and said, "Let's talk somewhere quiet." After giving a single nod, Maira walked barefoot over the debris behind her, with one shoe missing and nothing broken or stolen in her bag. She believed she was finally over the worst of it, but fate or whatever cruel process was at work. Miss Norris moved to leave, but the force-ran airport protocol wasn't finished with her yet. "Please come over here with me," Charles asked, not as a request, but as an order dressed politely. When Maira hesitated, she put her hand on the strap of her tattered backpack and questioned, "What's the problem?" in a cautious tone that wasn't confrontational, but yet wasn't subservient. Charles didn't respond right away. Instead, he gestured to a nearby service counter that was away from the crowd, but still visible enough for a few curious onlookers to pause while scrolling through their phones. "We've had an issue regarding your ticket," he said, "and once they reach the counter, some irregularities that need clarification." She frowned. "I already went through security. I checked in hours ago." "Yes, and now I'm checking your authorization to be on this flight business class, correct?" "Yes, flying alone, 17 years old." "Yes," he tapped a tablet, slowly swiping with one finger as if he was looking for a reason to disbelieve her. "We have reason to believe this ticket was issued in error," he said after a pause, "possibly fraudulently purchased." "I'll need to see the credit card used, identification, and the device or email that shows confirmation of the booking," Maira said, raising her eyebrows. She opened her phone and saw the email from her father that included her itinerary. "My dad booked it. Chuck Norris. The confirmation is with me." Charles looked up abruptly and said, "I apologize, did you say Chuck Norris?" She nodded, and he laughed briefly, not aloud but with an air of incredulity. Why didn't he turn the tablet to show her the booking details, including her name, flight, and class of service? The name on the card was redacted as a simple system precaution, nothing out of the ordinary, but he still used it. "You'll understand that we can't verify anything with this." He said, "I can text him," adding that he was already on his way and would arrive any moment. "He's not just Chuck Norris, he's pulling up in a blacked-out SUV with a Secret Service." Charles exhaled, as if he had heard 100 stories like this one. "Let me guess," he muttered, his voice tightening with sarcasm. "Escort proper." Maira blinked, as she felt the weight of his words. Not just his incredulity, but also the assumption that he was lying and that she didn't deserve this seat. She repeated, "I'm telling the truth." And he disregarded her. One of the staff members then whispered something to him. She looked at him and said, "I'm sorry." But there was no apology in his voice. "Until we can verify full payment and identity, your boarding is denied." He nodded as if it were nothing, saying, "We reserve the right to revoke access if there is concern of fraud or misrepresentation." "I'm not misrepresenting anything. I didn't steal anything. This is my name, my father." She stopped, her hands shaking once more. "I'm not going to argue," Charles said, adding that if the person who paid for this ticket wants to come down and speak to us directly, we'll reconsider. But until then, please step aside. She did not move. Charles glanced at the two agents, standing close by, and nodded to Kurt, who then escorted her out of the boarding area. "No, wait," she said. "You can't just call whoever you need from the public terminal. You'll need to re-enter security if the tickets are reinstated. Have a nice day," he said. The words were like knives. She stood motionless as the agent stepped up, gently gesturing towards the corridor. "Let's go, miss." She didn't resist, not because she agreed, but because she had nothing left to fight with. Instead, she walked between them in silence, each step echoing against the polished floor, her eyes burning not from tears, but from the sting of swallowing them. Drivers turned to observe. Several of them recognized her from earlier. The agent next to her kept looking ahead, going too quickly as if he wanted it to end, while the other remained silent behind her when they arrived at the glass doors near the exit. Some whispered, while others stared at their phones as if they weren't watching. The corridor opened towards the baggage area. Maira eventually stopped when her legs became weak and her phone buzzed in her pocket. She took it out with numb fingers, and the screen showed that her dad was calling, which she answered on the second ring. Chuck sounded quite urgent and clear. "And Maira, what's going on? They took my ticket," she whispered. Her voice broke halfway through the sentence. "They said it was fake. They didn't believe me. They said you had to come fix it yourself." There was silence on the other end. "Then where are you?" "They're escorting me to baggage claim. Stay right where you are," he said. "Firm, steady. Don't move. I'll be there in 10. She nodded, though he couldn't see it. "Okay, I mean it, baby girl. Don't move an inch." The call ended. She stood there staring through the glass at the people walking by with luggage and families, at the automatic doors that opened and closed like the airport was breathing without her. The agents behind her started to walk again, but she didn't follow. She turned her back to them, leaned against the cold metal railing near the hallway wall, and sank down to sit on the tile floor. She pulled her knees up to her chest and rested her forehead against them. She didn't care who watched anymore. Let them look. Let them wonder. Let them film. She was done trying to explain herself to people who didn't want to listen. She stayed there silent until the sound of firm, heavy footsteps cut through the space. A hush fell over the nearby travelers. Heads turned, phones lifted. Even the agents behind her shifted uneasily. Maira looked up to see that it was Chuck Norris. He wasn't in a movie or on TV, and his slow, deliberate steps were evident. He was dressed in a worn gray jacket, dark jeans, and his old training shoes. His presence was louder than anything else in the room, and he didn't say anything at first. He approached her and offered to hold her hand, but she nodded without warning, and he turned to face the agents behind her. His voice was cold steel, and someone had better start talking now. Stood Chuck. His hands were still by his sides, but he was staring straight ahead at the man who was approaching Charles, the terminal supervisor, who was now walking noticeably more slowly. Charles's face was pale, his lips were tight. His suit jacket was slightly crooked, as if he had hurried to put it back on, and his sweat glistened just beneath his hairline. When he finally stopped in front of Chuck, his hand trembled a little as he extended it. Charles had the appearance of a man who had realized he had made the kind of mistake that could end a career. Chuck didn't grab his hand. Instead, he just glanced at it before lifting his gaze back to Charles's face. "You are the one who pulled her ticket, Mr. Norris, sir. I can't express how sorry I am for what occurred here today." "Yes, sir." Charles swallowed visibly. "I got an alert from our system and followed the rules, but it's obvious that I should have looked into the policy more." Chuck reiterated that a 17-year-old girl policy was being humiliated in a silent manner. Charles's voice cracked. "Sir? No, absolutely not. I mean, I didn't realize she wasn't told she was your Chuck. She told you who she was, and Chuck said it quietly but clearly over all the noise in the terminal. She showed you her ID, her boarding pass, and her name, and all you saw was someone who didn't fit your picture of someone who should be traveling in business class. I admit that I made terrible assumptions, and I'm going to personally make sure that this doesn't happen again. I've already told our team to reinstate her ticket, sir, and we'll upgrade her if necessary, and I'll talk to the entire floor staff about the incident." Chuck didn't blink. "Her name is on the ticket, yes, sir, absolutely. Who paid for it?" "Your name, sir." Chuck's eyes narrowed a little, but you continued to show her that you respected her. Charles nodded rapidly, like a man clinging to a fraying rope. "You're absolutely right, that's all on me," Chuck said, quietly looking around at the small group of people nearby, half of whom were holding phones while ostentatiously texting, but who were obviously filming everything. "We'll handle it," Chuck said. "I mean, we'll reach out to the media if necessary. We'll issue a formal statement. We'll clear the record." Chuck furrowed his brow. "I'm not here to make declarations." Charles's voice trailed off, almost begging. "Please let me know if there is anything else we can do, Mr. Norris. I'm available at all times. I'll personally accompany your daughter through. Security, wait with her at the gate and submit disciplinary reports. Anything you require." Chuck looked at Maira, who was standing a few feet away, as he turned slightly. He wasn't tall and didn't have Chuck's muscle or fame, but when he stepped up, everyone made room. He was wearing a blazer that didn't look expensive, but was well maintained, and his shoes tapped the floor in a steady rhythm that said he wasn't there to waste time. Behind him he was still shaking, but he was listening to every word, and the room had calmed down a little. Mr. Henson, the regional director, approached Chuck Norris directly, halted at a reasonable distance, and spoke in a tone that reduced the turmoil somewhat. "I really apologize for the events of today." Chuck didn't say anything immediately away, sir. Henson looked at Maira before turning back to himself. "We've studied what happened, and I've already talked to Charles and our other staff members. We've discussed how there were mistakes in every judgment procedure and, more significantly, human decency." Chuck nodded slowly, saying, "You're right. I appreciate that you didn't leave and that you handled this the way you did, especially considering how public it has become." Chuck's voice was low, and we just wanted to get on the plane. "I know that," Henson stated. "I've already revalidated your daughter's ticket, same seat, same class, and she's been added to our priority clearance. For the remainder of the day, no more gate trouble, no more random checks." Chuck glanced at Maira, who had been silent since their last conversation. Her hands were still in her hoodie sleeves, and her eyes had that faraway look once more. One foot was still in that moment when the cup broke, when people laughed, when they didn't believe her, and she would be escorted to the plane through a secure lane. "I'll personally walk you both to the terminal entrance if that's okay," Henson added. Chuck said, "That'll do," and the other airport employees moved farther away, none of them speaking at this point. Some of them avoided making eye contact, while others were obviously observing the burgeoning crowd behind the glass. Travelers shooting wide-eyed whispering, they realized they were a part of a moment that would not pass silently. Chuck turned his head and said in a calm tone, but with a hint of steel in it, "Your folks must remember something." Henson waited for my daughter, who wasn't requesting a favor or attempting to circumvent the system. She came in with her own name, story, and valid ticket, and all she received in return was suspicion, derision, and a degree of treatment that no one should tolerate. Not her, not anyone. You're entirely correct. Henson's voice remained strong as he said, I'll be talking to corporate. There will be training and consequences. It's our job now to make sure it never happens again. This time, Chuck chose not to nod. Instead, he simply looked at the man and let the silence speak before turning to Maira, who had been fighting to be believed for almost 2 hours through the stares, the broken mug, the interrogation, and the fight. She looked up at him, trying to read his face now, and nodded, but not very enthusiastically. Henson gestured for the employee to lead them to the far lane designated priority access, but as they did so, the mob shuffled once more and the phones went down. Continuing whispers, Maira walked right behind her father, one hand still holding onto the ripped strap of her backpack. She didn't look left or right, instead looking straight ahead through the glass, past the metal detectors and past the agents who now gave her a tense, quiet nod. She was back in control, but only just inside the last security queue, where it was warmer and quieter. Chuck looked her in the eyes and said, "You did good." She smiled a little, but it didn't last, and she admitted, "I know it's over, but he waited." She said, "I lost it back there." But Chuck said, "You weren't pushed, but I shouldn't have let them see how much it hurt." The boarding door was still open when Chuck looked down at Maira and made his choice. That's just being human. Anyone who believes they can push people around just because they're in uniform or behind a desk should feel ashamed. She didn't respond, but her shoulders relaxed slightly. A child walking towards something larger than a flight, not as a legend and his shadow, but as father and daughter walking towards something earned. "I'll accompany you," she said, blinking in astonishment, "but you don't have to. I can go by myself." After what she had been through, the way they had looked at her, spoken to her, and touched her belongings, Chuck shook his head and said, "You're not getting on that plane without me sitting right beside you." There was no room for argument in his voice, not because he was angry, not because he didn't trust her, but he couldn't let her fly off into that sky with hands still shaking He approached the gate agent with a broken heart, and after a brief conversation and one look, he found a seat. When your name still carried weight, they boarded the plane quietly, slipping into their row close to the front. Most of the passengers were already buckled in and preoccupied with their own concerns, but a few glanced over, some curiously and some with their phones halfway up. However, Chuck disregarded them. He put his suitcase beneath the seat, assisted Maira with hers, and then relaxed while the cabin doors clicked shut and the sound of the aircraft filled the stillness. Sitting by the window with her arms folded tightly across her chest, she didn't cry or speak. Instead, she just gazed at the patch of sky visible through the smudged glass. On her lap was a small white towel that had been folded and gently held in both hands. Inside, wrapped in tissue, were the broken pieces of the mug that she hadn't let go of since they left the terminal. After observing her for a time, Chuck said, "You're going to hold on to those the entire flight." She didn't look at him, but he leaned closer and spoke softly. "Let me see your hands, I'm fine." She paused, then slowly unfurled her fingers. Despite the shallow incisions, she had multiple tiny red lines on her palm, one of which was still slightly bleeding at the base of her thumb. Chuck remained silent and took out a clean handkerchief from his jacket. It was the same old one he always kept the corners frayed just a bit. He took her hand without asking and moved slowly and softly to clean the blood, as if it hurt him more than she did. She saw his eyes burn and said, "You should have let them help you." "They didn't care," she whispered. Chuck took his time responding, folding the cloth over and repeatedly cleaning his touch without hurrying or being rough. After he was done, Maira's fingers began to loosen up, and he kept her hand for a brief time longer. "You know," he continued, "your eyes are still on her skin, and you remind me so much of him." She looked over in confusion. "Your dad?" and gulped. With his palm on his knee, Chuck leaned back in his chair. Now, voice low had a way of being quiet, always thinking, and never speaking unless it was necessary. But when he did speak, people listened. Maira remained silent, and he was stubborn too. You would argue with him until your face turned blue, and he wouldn't budge. He had that fire in his chest, just like you. But he used it to stand up for other people, mostly because he couldn't look the other way when something was wrong. Chuck went on. There was this fire a few years before you were born, and the whole place went up like matchwood for trucks were late, and people were screaming from the windows. He paused, and your dad just ran in. Her eyes widened, didn't wait for permission, didn't pause to think, didn't stop 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 to think, and took off through the smoke. Chuck's voice became quiet as he escorted 4 people out, a mother and her infant, 2 elderly men who were unable to walk, and Maira, who covered her mouth with one hand. Chuck now glanced out the window, but by the time he returned for the 5th, the roof had collapsed. Chuck nodded slowly, his expression serene but distant, while Maira closed her eyes. He didn't make it, but those people did. And that's the man who reared you. That's the blood you bear. The quiet between them was packed with too much emotion, like a balloon. Maira glanced at the small, useless pieces in her lap, then at her hand, which was neatly wrapped in the handkerchief. Without saying anything, she leaned over and put her arms around Chuck, folding herself into him as though she had finally finished bearing the weight of the day. Her shoulders shook, and her breath caught. Chuck held her by the arm, one hand on the back of her head, and he didn't say anything at first. When the tears stopped and the shaking subsided and she started to breathe quietly, she whispered, "Thank you for coming and staying and not walking away." He kissed the top of her head, saying, "I'm not going anywhere." She pulled back her eyes, a little, her eyes turning red, and she apologized if I caused any trouble. Chuck looked her in the eye, saying, "You didn't cause trouble. You were in trouble, and you stood your ground." She attempted to smile, but it didn't quite work. "I'm aware that I'm not you." Chuck shook his head and interrupted her, saying, "You are my daughter in every way that matters." Her face broke, but he pulled her back and rested his chin gently on her hair before saying, "You've always been that little girl I held the first time your mom let me try, the one who used to run out barefoot to hand me water after practice, the one who stared down the neighbor's pit bull at age 5 like it was nothing." She laughed through the tears, and I remembered that you looked him dead in the... She wiped her cheeks with the side of her sleeve and laughed louder this time, and Chuck laughed and left as if frightened. "Maira, you're strong." Chuck leaned back and gave her another serious look. "You fight because you know why you fight, and you don't give up when you know you're right, not because..." She nodded, and the plane's buzz intensified as the wheels jolted forward and the engine roared to life. "It's okay if it's broken," Chuck murmured, looking down at the bundle in her lap. "Sometimes broken things serve as a reminder of what counts most." That's it, people. That was Maira Norris, the girl who carried more than just a name. I don't know about you, but this story truly got to me. She didn't respond. She simply reached over and grasped his hand, and this time she didn't let go. It's not just about airports, security, or even celebrity names. It's about dignity and what it's like to be young and judged to carry something precious, like a memory or a name, and have it dismissed or even destroyed. Then, to have someone stand up for you with quiet, unwavering love instead of with fists or threats, because Chuck Norris understood that strength isn't in how loud you shout, but in how steady you stand. Let's be honest, how can you not admire his calm authority and fierce loyalty, the way he wiped his daughter's wounds and told her that she was his, not because of blood, but because of heart? That's the kind of love this world needs more of. Maira didn't just survive that day. She stood her ground, and in the end she walked forward, not in anyone's shadow, but in her own strength. Please leave a remark below. I read them all. If you haven't already, please remember to hit the subscribe button, like, and share so that we may continue to hear these touching tales till the next time. Remember that shattered things still have meaning, like Maira's cup, and be compassionate, strong, and upright.